A military tour flight above the shrouded Shangri-La Valley in May 1945 was tragically cut short when the Gremlin Special plummeted into the unexplored jungle of New Guinea. Only 3 of the 24 individuals on board made it through the terrifying ordeal that began as they were about to embark on one of the most remarkable rescue missions of World War II. Somehow, they managed to escape unscathed. Here, we tell the incredible story of the wartime New Guinea Special's survival. Your continued support of our channel is greatly appreciated. Thanks to your support in the form of subscriptions and engagement, we will keep bringing you these amazing stories. Allow me to delve into the story of today. Pay close attention at all times. This information might end up saving your life. As the end of World War II drew near in the spring of 1945, American forces stationed in Dutch New Guinea looked for measures to raise morale among their troops. Among the more out-of-the-ordinary pursuits was a flight over the enigmatic and unspoiled Shangri-La Valley, often called the Balam Valley. The Allies had only just recently found this secluded spot, tucked up in the foothills. The soldiers were enchanted by the verdant scenery and the scattered ancient settlements. One such morale-boosting flight took place on May 13, 1945, when 24 people, including military personnel and members of the Women's Army Corps, boarded a C-47 plane called the Gremlin Special. The objective was straightforward: to provide a bird's-eye view of the Shangri-La Valley, a place that appeared to have escaped the passage of time. The trek took on an air of mystery and adventure, due to rumors that the valley was home to indigenous peoples who had never interacted with outsiders. With everyone on board eager to see the enigmatic valley, the airplane took off without a hitch. Unaware of what lay ahead, the passengers joked and laughed as the plane climbed, relishing in the momentary respite from the brutal reality of war. Unbeknownst to anyone, what started out as a mundane sightseeing expedition would quickly spiral into an unimaginable nightmare. No one foresaw the danger that awaited them as they gazed in awe at the magnificent valley below. The mood on board the Gremlin Special went from exhilaration to fear as it dipped into the Shangri-La Valley. The plane, which had been flying steadily up until then, went into a tailspin after getting trapped in a strong downdraft. Seasoned pilots, pilot and co-pilot battled valiantly to regain height, but the rugged terrain proved too much. Because of the valley's thick vegetation and precipitous cliffs, there was little room for mistake. In a matter of seconds, the sightseeing trip for the passengers transformed into a struggle for survival as the plane dove towards the mountainside. It had a devastating effect. The plane tore its fuselage apart the second it touched down on a slope covered with forest, setting off a chain reaction of explosions. Tragically, 19 out of the 24 passengers perished in the first impact. The crash site was a picture of complete destruction, with the plane's charred remains littering the forest floor and just a handful of parts identifiable. After being tossed out of the rubble, the survivors were in a state of shock and couldn't believe what had happened. Being one of the lucky few to escape unharmed, Lieutenant John McCollum wasted no time assessing the situation. Sergeant Kenneth Decker lay nearby with severe burns and injuries, while Corporal Margaret Hastings was alive but critically injured. Even though they managed to escape the collision, Eleanor Hanna and Laura Blay, both members of the Women's Army Corps, tragically died from their injuries within hours. This left only 3 of them to face the merciless wilderness. The impact shattered the jungle's oppressive calm, and the only sound to break it was the muted sobs of the survivors, who were still trying to make sense of what had happened. One of the world's most inhospitable locations had trapped the survivors. They were alone, wounded, and in the middle of New Guinea, surrounded by thick jungle with no obvious way out. The prospect of rescue seemed bleak. The first order of business was to stay alive. The crash site was shrouded in shade since the dense jungle canopy obscured much of the sunshine. The aroma of smoldering fuel and decaying vegetation permeated the atmosphere. Even though he was shocked and hurt, McCollum took command, realizing they needed to move fast to survive. A 3-week nightmare in the jungle lay ahead of the 3 survivors as they set out on a trek that would push them to their physical and mental limitations, utilizing only the few items they had managed to recover and their wits. Since no one else was in a life-threatening condition, McCollum took charge. Finding a more secure area with enough visibility for rescue planes to see them was their first concern, as he knew from experience. The survivors, using their meager energy, searched the debris for any valuable artifacts. Aside from drinking water and hard candies, they also managed to snag various signaling parts from the jet. They made do with what little they had. There was no stopping the forest. The heavy undergrowth made it difficult to move, and the oppressive humidity depleted their strength. Decker and Hastings, who were both in terrible pain from their burns and injuries, walked carefully, each step a reminder of how dangerous their predicament was. The severity of Decker's burns was such that the danger of infection was increasing with each passing hour. Despite suffering injuries herself, Hastings refused to give in to hopelessness. They trudged through the bush for days, hoping to find a clearing where rescue planes might spot them easier. Rough boulders, steep inclines, and dense underbrush made for punishing terrain that reduced their speed to a crawl. Nighttime brought the jungle to life with the melodies of insects and faraway animal noises, heightening their feeling of seclusion. There was an extreme scarcity of both food and water. Although they were making do with rations, the survivors' precarious situation was getting worse by the day. McCollum, drawing on all of his military experience, sought out alternate food sources, eventually settling on eating insects and plants they saw. However, the survivors were acutely aware that time was of the essence as their injuries, particularly Decker's gangrene, deteriorated. A turning point subsequently arrived. A tiny clearing was discovered by the survivors. It wasn't perfect, but it was their only hope for survival. They hoped that passing planes would see them as they fashioned makeshift signals out of the debris, exhausted and feeble. In order to provide some cover from the weather, McCollum also constructed a simple shelter using the plane's wreckage. Their hopes started to dwindle as the jungle's hold appeared unbreakable, no matter how hard they tried. When they contacted the local tribes of the region, their seclusion was abruptly broken. The Dani people lived in the valley they had fallen into. They had been cut off from the rest of society for generations. The initial meeting between Dani and McCollum, Decker and Hastings was a bizarre and unsettling experience. As they warily approached, the spear-wielding tribesmen wore looks that conveyed both interest and wariness. This meeting may determine the destiny of the survivors, and McCollum was well aware of how precarious the situation was. In a flash, he offered the remaining hard candies to the tribesmen, a seemingly insignificant act that took on great meaning at that very time. The Dani took the offer because they were curious about the unfamiliar meal, and because they saw no danger from the strangers. Sharing even just a little bit helped bring the two groups closer together. The frequency of Dani's visits to the survivors increased as time went on. Despite the language barrier, both groups were able to communicate well through facial expressions and gestures. Although it was unfamiliar, the Dani fed the survivors sweet potatoes and other local produce, which supplied much-needed nourishment. Some of their pain was alleviated when the tribesmen taught them how to make simple medicines from local herbs. The Dani's presence has both positive and negative aspects. The survivors could finally break out of their shells and connect with other people, which had an enormous positive impact on their mental health. Furthermore, the Dani could only do so much to assist. Their own survival in the brutal jungle was a constant battle, and they lacked the medical expertise to treat Decker's and Hastings' ailments as they worsened. A closer relationship formed between the Dani and the surviving as time passed. Intrigued by the survivors' unusual attire and possessions, the Dani loosened their guard and became more amiable. In response, McCollum and the others adapted to their new surroundings by drawing on the information the Dani had shared with them. Even as their bond deepened, they were both acutely aware that this was only a transitory alliance, forged out of absolute need. The health of the survivors kept getting worse. Hastings battled excruciating pain and weariness, while Decker's scorched ears were starting to infect. Constant stress and inadequate nutrition were taking their toll on McCollum, who was still pretty robust. Despite the Dani's best efforts, the survivors required assistance beyond what the tribesmen and jungle could provide. This was evident when they witnessed their newfound friends in pain. Their connection with the Dani had brought them solace, but they were running out of time. Their whereabouts were known, and signals had been transmitted. It was now the responsibility of the outside world to locate them before the clock ran out. After 3 weeks since the catastrophe, the survivors' hope was dwindling. Throughout their ordeal, McCollum, Decker, and Hastings had faced insurmountable obstacles, beginning with the aftermath of the crash and continuing with the relentless jungle. However, when their fortitude was dwindling, a ray of hope appeared in the sky above. The sound of faraway jet engines was the first. The survivors, who had become used to jungle noises, could make out the strange sound in an instant. They hurried to the area they had made with Danny's assistance and furiously waved bright pieces of cloth and homemade flags to indicate their whereabouts. The survivors' spirits plummeted for a split second as the plane swooped low over them, seemingly vanishing into thin air. The plane started to descend, releasing supplies and a radio, their first connection to the outside world in weeks, much to their relief. In that instant, the survivors felt a surge of emotion. It was via the radio that McCollum was able to contact the rescue squad, but getting everyone out of there was no picnic. Drones and planes couldn't land anywhere near them due to the thick forest and rough terrain. It was clear to the rescuers that a traditional rescue operation would be ineffective. They required a daring and original strategy. Because of their specialized design for use in operations in rugged terrain, Waco CG-4A freight gliders were chosen. Gliders, which could be pulled by planes and dropped into small spaces, were the sole practical way to rescue the people stuck in the wilderness. The rescuers were hell-bent on getting the survivors home, so they risked everything to do it. As early as June 28, 1945, the inaugural glider descended into the Shangri-La Valley. As it touched down in the clearing, the glider narrowly avoided obstructions during the stressful landing. As the rescuers stepped out, the Danny, who had never laid eyes on such machinery before, gazed in wonder. As soon as the glider landed, the paratroopers on board began evaluating the wounded and making preparations for their extraction. The initial groups to be evacuated were McCollum, Decker, and Hastings. Their ascent out of the valley was a perilous ordeal due to the complicated and risky process of having the glider retrieved mid-air by a tow plane. The pilot's expertise and the rescue team's tenacity, however, allowed them to safely extract all 3 survivors from the valley. Subsequent flights recovered the remaining paratroopers and equipment, requiring many missions for the rescue operation. On their way back to civilization, the survivors thought about their terrifying experience. They had endured the unfathomable, an airplane crash, life-threatening injuries, the wilderness, and the fear of not knowing whether they would survive. It had been a miracle that they had survived. Their narrative became a powerful metaphor of how the human spirit can overcome immense adversity. The tale of McCollum, Decker, and Hastings captivated a world exhausted from war when they returned, and they were acclaimed as heroes. Another cultural divide was bridged when the Danny people, who had been instrumental in their survival, were also acknowledged. An inspiration to human resilience, resourcefulness, and bravery, the Gremlin Special Rescue of 1945 is still considered a top 20th century survival story. Hopefully, you were captivated by this tale of survival just like we were. Here are 2 videos we thought you might enjoy if you're interested in true stories of overcoming incredible odds. More incredible actual instances of human resilience are explored in each one. Please subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. Until we meet again, maintain your curiosity and your strength.